Content of the following program, including all statements from the host and guests, is to provide general information and commentary about the law. Under no circumstances does any statement made by a host or guest to a caller or listener constitute legal advice or the formation of an attorney-client relationship, and the material from this program should not be viewed as a substitute for personal consultation with an attorney. Welcome to Talk Legal with Jeff Van Treese, who brings you all the latest news in the legal world. Jeff will be discussing a variety of legal topics with experts in the field. If you would like to ask a question or share a story on the air, please call toll-free 888-565-1470. Once again, that's 888-565-1470. Now, let's talk legal with Jeff Van Treese.
Good evening and welcome to another edition of Talk Legal. I'm your host, Jeff Van Treese. I'm an attorney with the law firm Oltman, Flynn & Kubler, where we practice intellectual property law, including patents, trademarks, and copyrights. You can check us out online and view all episodes of this show by visiting our website at oltmanpatent.com. That's oltmanpatent.com. I have a very special guest this evening. He's the director of the Safe Climate Campaign. That's an environmental advocacy group, and he led the 25-year fight for the Clean Car Standard, which is the single largest step by any nation to cut climate change, which was a 54.5 mile per hour goal. That's the current goal. And he's also the former director of the Sierra Club Global Warming and Energy Program. So he's a very accomplished environmental advocate, and this evening we're going to be discussing the recent scandal over at Volkswagen and get his thoughts on it in the future of what might be happening with this environmental catastrophe, quite frankly, that we've now been made aware of as of last week. So, Dan, can you hear me?
I can indeed. Thanks for having me on.
Thanks so much for joining us. I'd like to get right into it. This scandal, basically from what we've heard so far, is that there has been the Volkswagen in its test the cars that were being tested for EPA mileage standards essentially had deceptive software that were giving numbers that didn't actually represent the true value with respect to the performance of the vehicle. The consequence of this is that the emissions for every mile driven was much, much higher than was originally indicated to the EPA, and now we've had a huge recall of 500,000 cars that have been recalled. My understanding is that Volkswagen has actually set aside something like $12 or $13 billion to either refit some of these cars or to simply repay the customers. In addition to that, the company faces up to $18 billion in fines. But really, what we have to focus on here is just the huge loss of life and human health that has really come out. We're looking at potentially many people that have suffered physical injury in the form of respiratory distress and asthma from nitrogen oxides that have been emitted with these vehicles. What are your thoughts on this generally and the future of what's going to happen to Volkswagen?
Well, first of all, this is an enormous fraud by a company that had asked and earned the public's trust. And they've now violated that trust by literally cheating on the tests that ensure that cars that don't pollute too much are put on the road. And not just in the United States, where, as you say, 500,000 vehicles have been recalled, but 11 million vehicles around the world were evidently subject to this cheating, in which Volkswagen put a computer code into the vehicles that told the testers when a vehicle was being tested that the vehicle was in compliance, but as soon as the test was over and the vehicle went on the road, the emission system that controls the pollution was turned off, and the vehicles polluted much more than they did during the test. And the folks who've done the testing said that in some of the vehicles that they looked at, there were 40 times the pollution levels that are allowed by law. So this is a big problem. Jeff, as you say, it's a major threat to health. There are a lot of people breathing soot and smog at levels that they shouldn't have to breathe. And some of them, ironically, are the customers of Volkswagen.
So we're dealing with not only the customers, the people that purchase the cars, but we're also dealing with people outside the vehicles, including surrounding motorists that are breathing in the exhaust. So
Exactly.
this is a very wide range of people that are potentially suffering the health effects of this fraud.
Yes, hundreds of millions of people are being exposed to more pollution because of the fraud that Volkswagen perpetrated. There are a number of things that the government can do to begin to fix the problem, and the first one was to issue this recall to have the cars brought back and fixed. They're now trying to figure out what that fix should be. Having produced a vehicle that produces too much pollution, it's not as easy to put that genie back in the bottle, and the company has announced that they will publicize in October what their proposed solution is. But it's really up to the company to fix the cars and EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency in Washington, to order them to fix them enough. So the first thing is that the government needs to do a full investigation to figure out what went wrong, who was it who was responsible for the decisions at Volkswagen to violate the law. Those people should be prosecuted criminally. The company itself needs to be punished to the maximum extent of the law, not just to get even with them, but really because you want to send a message to other companies that they shouldn't engage in this kind of behavior. And if we were to think that Volkswagen were alone in cheating this way, unfortunately, they're not. Every major auto company, General Motors, Ford, Chrysler, even VW before, all the diesel engine manufacturers, Honda, all of these companies have been caught in prior years cheating on these same kinds of tests, where they deliberately avoided the emissions control system and produced too much pollution. So all of these companies need to be shown that if they violate the law, they're going to be punished. The penalty under the Clean Air Act is $37,500 per vehicle violation, which means that in the case of VW, it could be an $18 billion fine. And that's enough, hopefully, of a disincentive that other companies wouldn't engage in this activity again.
You mentioned earlier that all of the auto companies are doing this or doing similar things, that they're not just engaged in making a negligent design, but they're actually intentionally, willfully, with premeditation, defrauding the public and putting out products that are likely to cause serious health effects and eventually kill people. That's pretty alarming, and it sort of brings in the whole concept of too big to jail. We've heard too big to fail, but in some cases like this, when you have an industry that has so much lobbying power, it becomes very difficult to actually criminally prosecute some of these the individuals that are responsible for this fraud. This was actually suggested by former Attorney General Eric Holder when he was talking about Wall Street and how it's just too difficult to bring criminal charges against some of these executives. I'm wondering if the same thing is probably going to happen here. It would seem difficult to imagine that anybody's going to go to jail, even though they definitely should. If you put a product out there that's likely to kill lots and lots of people, you probably should go to jail when you're intentionally not disclosing, you're intentionally covering up a very serious public health hazard.
Well, the government has to figure out what kinds of remedies they can impose. And yes, indeed, if there are executives who are found to have ordered the violation of the law, they should be prosecuted criminally and put in jail if that can be done. I want to just clarify one thing. The companies that I listed, other than VW, have previously engaged in this kind of cheating. We don't yet know whether any of them is doing this currently, and that's one of the things that EPA needs to find out. All of the companies have done it before. Are they doing it now? And if they are, they need to be moved against, just as the government is moving against VW.
You mentioned that we don't know exactly what's happened. There's been some discussion about the auto safety and the crash standards and so forth, mileage standards. These are things that are sort of self-regulated, self-reported, if you will. And that's sort of analogous to students in high school or college grading their own tests and then submitting their own grades to the registrar's office to be posted, as opposed to going through a professor that actually grades the papers or the exams. And the absurdity of that should be clear on its face, that if you if you only have self-reporting, then you're going to create a moral hazard situation, and you're going to have fraud. You're going to have rampant fraud because there's no outside governmental authority that's actually verifying that these numbers are accurate.
And that's got to change. One of the key things that the government will need to do is revamp the way vehicles are tested, and disallow any more self-testing by auto companies. They've proven that they cheat, and they can't be trusted to police themselves, as you say. The problem is one of resources. The government doesn't really have enough funds to set up its own separate testing system. And because the auto companies have proven that they're not trustworthy, they will need to pay for this new system of government testing, because we can't trust them to do it themselves. Someone has to do it. The people who have to do it are the government, who create the laws to protect us. It's their job to protect us. And so they will need to find a way to assess fees on the auto companies to pay for the creation of test facilities, including non-laboratory testing. One of the problems that you may have been reading about in the papers is that these tests that VW designed the cheat for are done inside a building under certain humidity conditions. The steering wheel doesn't turn. The vehicle is run at a certain constant speed. That's how the computer was able to tell that there was a test going on. So one of the things that needs to happen is that in addition to this a dynamometer, a roller machine test that's done inside a building and is accurate to a certain degree, there need to be additional tests outside in real road conditions, and there are new testing devices that can measure what's coming out of the tailpipe and take a picture of the license plate at the same time, so that if there's a need to repair the vehicle, the owner can be contacted.
When you say the government doesn't have the funds to do this, that being a concern, you have to think of the exponentially higher costs that the government's going to have to deal with respect to illness and death. When we have this number of people with asthma, that's going to create huge costs that are much greater than it would be to build the facilities. When we look at government spending, there's really nothing that's more efficient than policing or monitoring public health. That's the most cost-effective thing because it prevents people from getting sick, and once people get sick, the costs just go up exponentially. So hopefully,
I agree completely, but the question is always how does the payment happen from what account? And the simplest way of dealing with this is to say that the automakers need to ensure that the funds are there to create the new testing system. I completely agree with you that it's far more expensive to pollute and then try to clean up people's lungs than it is to make sure that the pollution doesn't come out of the car in the first place.
Absolutely. There's a lot of other issues that are going to come up here. There's going to be potential lawsuits both here in the United States as well as around the world. In Europe, certainly, there's going to be, in fact, there's been some studies that think that the per capita illness and death rate in Europe might actually be even greater than here in the U.S. It's going to be interesting to see whether there's going to be lawsuits filed in each of these countries individually, in the European Union, in the U.S. This could potentially create a money issue with Volkswagen and whether they're going to be able to pay all these claims. It might even be possible that Volkswagen goes belly up.
Well, that's conceivable, although according to the people I've talked to in the industry, it isn't the most likely outcome. But before Volkswagen goes away, they need to clean up this mess that they've created. They very deliberately, willfully created a hazard for the public, not just of the United States, but other countries as well, and they need to clean it up. And yes, it's going to be expensive, but they might have thought about that when they were designing a system to cheat the tests on the government Environmental Protection Agency.
I have to talk about that for just a second, because you said it's something they should have thought of. They probably did think of it and just thought that they weren't going to get caught. And that's, I think, part of the problem here is that the rule of law is supposed to apply to everyone. We're a country of laws, not of men, and we have equal protection under the law. It applies to everyone. But when you have these huge corporations that have lots of profit at stake, they might actually rationally calculate the likelihood of getting caught and then factor that into the decision to endanger the public. And that is the exact opposite of any sound environmental policy that would ever be allowed, where a corporation is potentially willfully endangering the public just because they think that they won't get caught. And that's why you really have to have punitive measures here. You have to have criminal prosecutions and people going to jail. You really can't just have fines because the whole concept, like I said earlier, of actually deciding whether or not to violate the law based upon a profit formula is just totally unacceptable.
It shows an extreme callousness about people. And, after all, even a company like VW sells its products to people. So you would think that they would have a higher regard for the people to whom they're trying to sell their product, and their neighbors and their friends and their relatives. The challenge here is that the government is the instrument that is going to have to fix this problem. And yes, it's abhorrent that Volkswagen did this. We need to make sure that it never happens again, which is why the fines and the penalties and possible prison sentences need to follow this fraud. But we also need to recognize that this is an industry that has an extreme hostility to environmental protection. They've opposed efforts in the Clean Air Act to clean up their emissions. They fought the legislation before it was passed. Once it was passed, they lobbied like mad to try to weaken the rules and insert loopholes. And now we find that a major company, the largest automaker in the world at the moment, has actually lied and has created cheat devices that prevent their emissions control system from working. So we need to step back a little bit and think also about how do we get these errant industries under control. And the auto companies, we'll find out how many other companies have engaged in similar activities to VW's. But the hostility of the industry is pretty rampant and pretty vociferous.
You mentioned the whole lobbying angle and how the auto industry has just vociferously lobbied against environmental protection. I have to ask you whether you think that this, the interests of the public have seriously taken a step back in the wake of Citizens United, especially with corporate personhood and so forth, because the very investigations that you're talking about might potentially be halted or stymied by the concept of the corporations are people that have rights, and so now you're going to have a warrant in order to search through Volkswagen's records and so forth. This is something. These are future legal challenges that might come up that are certainly going to delay or hinder the investigation now that we have corporate personhood.
There are a whole series of similar challenges, and yes, I think there are real dangers there. I think there's also danger that I learned of recently, that the Copyright Office at the Library of Congress is in the process of deciding whether the computer code of the sort that Volkswagen designed to get around the law is a secret, and therefore anybody who discovers what that code provides, including the people who discovered this fraud and reported it to the government, whether they would be violating the law to do that. So there are a whole series of problems that the power of these corporations pose to the people with lungs. And we need to solve these problems. They're not going to be solved overnight, but educating ourselves about it, talking to our leaders about it, our elected representatives, is pretty critical to say we want these problems fixed.
Is this going to be something similar to the BP oil spill, where we have somebody that's appointed, usually a private accounting firm that's appointed to handle claims, and then we remember with BP how there were three options. You could either take a fixed amount of money and then you couldn't come back. You could take a smaller amount, but then you could retain your right to go to court later. And neither of those options were very appealing to the victims of the oil spill. when we're looking here at this situation, we might have something similar where people just get nominal amounts and say, take this now, it's a sure thing, and then go away. That's something that we're somewhat concerned about. Remember, with BP, it was they had a $20 billion fund that was used to pay the victims, but the total amount should have been probably much, much more than that. Do you think we're going to see something similar down those lines?
I think there will be a problem making sure that people are compensated and that our lungs are protected. I'm not sure it'll be the same kind of a system that you described that the BP situation created. But I think the first priority is to clean up the cars so that they're not polluting as much. That's EPA's responsibility, and they're going to have to make sure that VW fixes the cars. There will be a number of people who wanted a clean diesel who aren't satisfied with the vehicle that they purchased because it's not clean enough. And they should be able to go back to Volkswagen and have it bought back at their original purchase price. Volkswagen isn't going to like that. And then there are going to be people who say, look, I don't know how much it's polluting, but I don't want to bring it in because it's running fine from my perspective. Those people need to be given an incentive to bring back the vehicle to make sure it's fixed so that it doesn't poison their neighbors. And VW is going to have to come up with an incentive, maybe $500, that you get when you bring your vehicle in for the recall. And for the people who don't even do that and who decide they're not going to bring it in for the recall, there needs to be some mechanism to ensure that those vehicles are brought in as well and cleaned up. Maybe their warranty is voided. Maybe they're no longer registered to continue to drive that vehicle on the road until they get it cleaned up. But there are going to be a whole series of these issues, and unfortunately, Volkswagen has put these vehicles out there and left it to the government to solve the problem.
Who's going to have a claim here? Because, like we said, it's both the people that own the vehicles as well as others that may have suffered lung damage from breathing in the pollution. Are those people going to have claims? It seems like it's going to be very difficult for somebody that comes in with asthma to say that Volkswagen caused their asthma. It's just going to be very difficult to prove. So that might also have been part of Volkswagen's calculation in doing this, is that anybody that they were injuring would have an impossible task of proving causation.
Well, there's an interesting article in today's New York Times in the Upshot section that evaluates how many people have actually died because of the increased pollution from these vehicles, and it's in the tens of people, possibly more than 100. Many more have gotten sick. Whether they can recover money damages, I don't yet know. It's the first priority needs to be to clean up the pollution and make sure that it stops. The next priority needs to be, in my completely unbiased view, to make sure that other companies aren't engaging in similar activity and to create a strong disincentive that they do so. And then after that, we need to figure out how do we make whole the people who've been injured. And yes, there probably will be private lawsuits. My guess is that the ones that will proceed will be the ones by owners of these vehicles as opposed to their neighbors who breathed in the extra smog and extra soot.
I have to, of course, bring up the fact that we are beginning the election cycle. The last couple of Republican debates got a huge viewership, and now we got the Democratic debate coming up. It would be nice to see this Volkswagen scandal actually brought into the public discourse during from the candidates in both parties. I think this would be a great counter-argument to the whole deregulation argument that we've seen from the right. And it would be nice to see that, just to sort of show by comparison. We've seen the whole Planned Parenthood scandal and how much attention has been given to that. There should certainly be equal amount of attention brought to this scandal when we think of all of the people that have been affected by this corporate malfeasance, and that there should be a call for more strict oversight of these industries going forward, and really to show what happens when the government sort of looks the other way.
Well, first of all, I'm not sure that there is a Planned Parenthood scandal. There certainly is a controversy.
Or I should say controversy.
The Missouri Attorney General announced today that they had done an investigation of Planned Parenthood and had found no wrongdoing on Planned Parenthood's part. But you're right. This is an enormous Volkswagen scandal. We need to ensure that our elected leaders are learning from the facts as they come out. It would be wonderful if during the debate, I agree with you, if the candidates were asked to address this question and what would they do about it, especially in the case of several candidates in one of the parties who called for the dissolution of the Environmental Protection Agency. They don't even want the folks who caught these wrongdoers at Volkswagen to exist anymore. So I think that's a good question to ask those guys.
Yeah, it seems like they want different rules for different people. You know, if you or I were driving on the road and got a traffic ticket, we couldn't take that as a write-off. Nor could we really complain that it is that we're being overly regulated when we're speeding, or if someone's accused of a crime, a petty crime. They don't really get to say, well, I'm just being over-regulated. Yet when a car company defrauds the public, intentionally and deliberately introduces a dangerous product into the stream of commerce, they can complain about over-regulation. And that just seems to be totally intellectually dishonest and inconsistent.
Well, and as you point out, they can also deduct any civil fine against taxes, which means that we're all paying for the BP disaster when we pay our taxes.
Yeah, and we can't take a deduction for our attorney's fees. If somebody's accused of a crime, you can't write off your attorney's fees for defending yourself. You can't write off a traffic ticket. Yet BP can write off their penalties, and it's very likely that Volkswagen will be able to write off their penalties as well. And in all likelihood, their officers will be able to get golden parachutes. In fact, I think there was a recent news story about that.
Well, I think our message to Volkswagen should be that if they put as much effort into making cleaner and better cars as they put into cheating, we'd all breathe easier.
We would, yeah. That's both literally and figuratively. We would breathe easier. We have about a minute left, and Dan, I really want to give you a very special thanks for coming on the show. I'm talking to Dan Becker, Esquire. He is a lifelong environmental advocate, and I would like to just give the last minute or so if you could just let us know what your organization does and where they can find out more.
Well, it's been a pleasure to be here, and thank you so much for having me on. The Safe Climate Campaign is an environmental advocacy group. We fight for cleaner cars and less global warming pollution. Our website is www.safeclimatecampaign.org, and we've got a lot of information up, and including some new op-ed pieces we've written about this Volkswagen scandal, and would love to communicate with anybody who has any questions or further comments that they'd like to make.
Thank you so much, Dan. I'd like to give another very special thanks to my guest. This is Jeff Van Treese from Talk Legal. Thank you so much, and have a great evening.
Thank you for listening to Talk Legal with Jeff Van Treese. Tune in next week for more insightful and exciting information about the law. You can contact Jeff by email at jvt2law@gmail.com or give him a call at 561-789-6866. That's 561-789-6866. The content of the preceding program, including all statements from the host and guests, is